Hi. So I want to talk about your protocols that you should have in place or you should put in place when you get a new dog. So this is for new puppies. Although the puppy protocols are a little different, they're more extensive. But this is for new puppies. This is for newly adopted shelter dogs. This is for dogs from a breeder. This is also for dogs that you want to really crack down on and start a strict training protocol. So if you've had this dog for 10 years and you realize, wow, his behavior is like way out of control and I really need to crack down on this is the protocol that you would go through. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to focus on new dogs. So when you bring a new dog home, there's a thing called the honeymoon period, and that is a very real thing. So the honeymoon period is when the dog doesn't really show its true nature. A lot of times, it can last days, it can last weeks, sometimes even last months. The dog is taken so far out of its normal environment, its normal comfort zone, that it kind of goes into self-preservation mode. If it's a shelter dog, it might sleep a lot. I know Abe did when I got him. He just slept the first week, just didn't do anything. He just slept because he was so anxious in the shelter environment that he could never really relax. So when he finally got into some peace and quiet, he just slept the whole week. But they might sleep a lot, they might be very well behaved, they might be very quiet, and you think, wow, we really lucked out with this dog. This dog's really well behaved, this dog's really sweet, this dog's great with the kids, this dog walks real nice on a leash and all that. And so because that dog has really great behavior, you are more tempted to be a lot more passive and a lot more permissive with that dog. So you give the dog free roaming, you let the kids play with the dog, get in their face and all that. You let the dog kind of free graze on food through the day, and all those things that you would normally allow your dog to do once the dog was really established in the home. It's very tempting to do that, but be very cautious because the honeymoon period is very real. And then when that honeymoon period kind of comes to an end, that dog is going to have weeks or months of patterned behavior of your permissive lifestyle, and it's going to be a lot harder to establish those rules and those boundaries after that honeymoon period has ended and you haven't had any rules or boundaries. So at the end of the honeymoon period, the dog true nature will kind of come out. So a lot of times that comes out in the way of pushy behavior, snotty behavior, bratty behavior. They might start growling at you when you say, hey, get off the couch. They might start growling at you when you try to, if you walk by their food. They might bite your kid, in a more extreme standpoint. They might pull on the leash a lot more. They might not listen to you in the home as much. It's a lot of the pushy, snotty behavior will come out after the honeymoon period is over. So what do you do to combat that? So from the very beginning, the best thing you can do with a new dog is implement just massive amounts of structure. It's going to seem really mean because for example, with Abe, he grew up in a shelter. He only really knew the four walls of bars around him. So it seems really unfair and mean to the dog to immediately start crating them a lot. But that's really what you need to do. So I'm going to go over the things that you really should be doing with a new dog, and hopefully I'll remember all of these. But the first thing is crate training. Crate training is one of the most important things that you can do with your dog, especially with your new dog. So crate training is kind of difficult, especially with older dogs, with adult dogs, because if they haven't been used to being crated, it's a big adjustment. But if you can do that right off the bat, it's going to be better for everybody. So crate that dog when you're not home. Don't let the dog free roam when you're not home. Absolutely not. Especially with a new dog, because the dog might not get in anything, but then as it gets used to the home, he's going to push his boundaries and he could get into something and he could eat something that he shouldn't and he could die. So crate the dog at night, crate the dog when you're not home. In the very beginning, Crate that dog if you are not actively looking after working with the dog. If you're not actively working, supervising that dog, you should be in a crate. And it seems really mean, and I get that, but it's what you gotta do. The second thing is affection. So in the beginning, there should be no freely given affection. So affection as a reward, as part of training, is totally fine. But don't shower the dog with unearned affection, just with freely given affection, because a lot of times dogs that come into a new environment are anxious or nervous. And freely given affection can actually encourage and nurture anxiety. So really work to make that affection a reward, something that the dog works for. That brings me to my next point, working for food. So if you can start from the very beginning and have that dog work for its daily meals, maybe not all of its daily meals, maybe you feed them breakfast in a bowl in a crate, feed them in a crate if you're gonna do that. But maybe for his dinner, you work with daily kibble. You know, you have that dog work for food. That way you become very important to that dog because you are the source of everything good in that dog's life, and you build a drive to work for you. So there's that. Okay, so there's crate, there's working for food, there's affection. Really just overall rules and boundaries. So it's a lot easier to be very, very strict in the very beginning and then loosen up later. It's very hard to go back after the dog has learned the rules of your household, being very permissive, going back and trying to crack down. So the way that an example that I give, or an analogy, is like a school bus driver. So the first week or so of school, the first couple months of school or whatever, that school bus driver is normally very strict because she wants to, normally it's a she, but this human wants to set the tone for what is the expectations of behavior out in the school bus. So you want to set the expectation, you want to set the tone, you want to be very strict up front. And then usually as the year goes on, as this human gets to know all of the other little humans on the bus, who is a troublemaker, who's a really good kid, what, you know, the intricacies of the behaviors of those children are, this human can be a little more permissive, can loosen up a little bit. But when you adopt a dog, and with continuing the school bus example, if you start really permissive when you don't know these humans, these tiny humans, you don't know them. You don't know if they're going to be good kids, if they're troublemakers. You don't know. If you start with really permissive attitudes and letting them get away with a lot, it's going to be very hard to walk that back and get control over all these humans later in the year and crack down. So when you get a dog, you don't know that dog. You don't know what it's going to be, because a dog that you see in the shelter is not the dog that you're adopting. There's only so much that you can judge by the behavior that the dog exhibits in a shelter environment. And I'm focusing on rescue dogs, on shelter dogs, because that's the majority of people that I work with. The clients that I have is with dogs that come from a rescue or a shelter environment. But the dog in the cage at the shelter is not the dog that you're bringing home. It's not. There's only so much that you can learn from that dog's behavior in the shelter. When the dog comes home, decompresses, it's a completely different dog. So you have to be aware of that. You don't really know what you're getting with a shelter dog. And I say that as an owner of 2 shelter dogs. I love my shelter dogs. Shelter dogs are the greatest dogs out there. I love them. But what you see in the shelter is not always what you get at home. So by enforcing very strict boundaries in the beginning, you allow yourself to be a little more permissive and loosen up later. So when I got Abe, and this is really good for like fearful dogs, nervous dogs in the shelter environment. So with Abe, when I got Abe, he was absolutely terrified. The most severe fear aggression case I've ever seen. So when I brought him home, massive amounts of structure. He was crated all the time. He didn't get a whole lot of freely given affection. We worked on obedience training. We worked on, basic stuff, really just to build his confidence. But I was very, very strict in the beginning to set the expectation of how I needed him to behave. Now, 2 years later, he sleeps on the bed with me. He almost never is leashed. He's always off leash. He gets to roam the house when Sky doesn't. He lives a more permissive lifestyle now because he's earned it and because I know my dog, and he doesn't have any behavioral issues anymore. Otherwise, he wouldn't have all that freedom. So, again, I'm sure that there's things that I've missed talking about this, but if you go to my website, engineeringchangetraining.com, you go to the resources tab or the training resources tab, or however I have it called, you can download my new dog protocol document, and it'll go over everything that I just talked about. So there's that. If you have any questions, let me know.